Okay, I think we can start. Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar on financing climate action. My name is Raidan Al-Saqaf. I'm the Economist in the Resident Coordinator Office in the UAE, and I'd like to warmly welcome you for this important discussion on climate finance as a key enabler for climate action. Today we have an interesting panel which we will discuss with some emphasis the regional financing dynamics, financing what, where, and by whom, and with some emphasis on adaptation. Today's session will start with the presentation from UNEP Finance Initiative by our colleagues from UNEP-FI and the regional center. And also we will have interventions from ESCWA, from the International Finance Corporation, and from our friends at IRENA. So with that, perhaps we can start the lead presentation. Paul, you have the floor.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much, Raidan, and also to Zoheir for organizing this fantastic webinar. Hopefully I can share the screen. So let me just put that there. I'm sorry, I've gone a little bit ahead. So just 2 seconds to take me back to the first slide. Yes, thank you very much, everybody. So UNEP-FI have been invited today to discuss climate finance, and in particular to discuss a report that was released just a couple of months ago this year around adaptation, and in particular how the finance sector, and even more in particular the banking sector, are responding to physical risks from climate change and adaptation. And we also conducted a couple of regional studies, including one focusing on the Middle East and North Africa region. And this work comes about perhaps from two drivers, really. First of all, is that over the past 3 to 4 years, we've been accelerating our work in the Middle East and North Africa region in partnership with the League of Arab States and with UNDP and a range of other UN and local partners. And also the Principles for Responsible Banking, which is our flagship initiative at UNEP-FI for banks, has been looking increasingly at the question of how to respond to a changing climate and how banks can build more resilient and adapted businesses. One of our first impact areas, in fact, our first impact area for the Principles for Responsible Banking was climate mitigation. So how do banks reduce their financed emissions? And that was launched back in 2019, and in 2020 we upgraded that, if you like, to the Net Zero Banking Alliance. But for a lot of our banking clients, physical risks, because of the location of their clients or because of the sectors that they operate in, are perhaps more material than emissions. So we were asked last year to have a closer look at adaptation, and over the course of 2022, we looked both at a global level and a regional level at adaptation and what banks are doing. And that forms the basis of work that we're carrying out this year on a more practical level. And I'll go into that a little bit later. So in the Middle East and North Africa region, what exactly is happening in terms of climate change? And I'll just go over this very quickly because I'm sure many of you who are joining today are aware of the impacts on the region. And on the Emirates as one of the key countries in the region. Probably there are three major impacts, direct impacts, that will impact perhaps more than others on the region. First of all, temperature extremes. It appears that according to the IPCC, average temperatures across the region are rising to possibly up to 7 times faster than the global average. And of course, that increases heat waves, it results in more extreme droughts, and of course it will impact on labor supply. A recent study shows that inequalities mean that laborers are 3 times more likely to die in one of the countries in the region than more wealthy residents. So this is not just a question of overall impacts, but it's also a question of climate justice and how it impacts on more vulnerable parts of society. Secondly, water stress, and already one of the world's most water-stressed regions is expected to become worse. So the Middle East is home to 12 of the 17 most water-stressed countries in the world. and water scarcity is expected to cost the region between 6 and 14% of GDP by 2050, according to the World Bank. The third, perhaps major impact, and is more of a chronic, slow developing impact, will be that of sea level rise. So sea level rise is expected to be between 30 centimeters and 1.2 meters by 2100, and this all depends on, of course, on the emission scenario we look at. And the impacts from that would be seawater intrusion, which will impact water supply and agriculture, and also impacts on coastal communities directly from flooding. And then some of the secondary impacts that will have across economies in the region through GDP loss as communities and economies respond to these impacts. It could lead to rising poverty, economic deprivation and displacement as it becomes impossible to live in some areas. Of course, there are impacts on agriculture in the wider region, which could lead to food price shocks and supply chain challenges. So how is the region responding to this? What is the state of adaptation finance, both from the public and private sector? And I know that other speakers today, particularly from ESCWA, will talk about this, but I'll just briefly give an overview from what we included in our study. So according to a recent ODI study, around $1.5 billion has been invested in climate finance since 2003. And most of this is going towards reducing emissions, despite the threats to society and economies of the physical impacts of climate change. And most of this climate finance is coming from public funding, both national and international, and also from multilateral development banks. Again, much of this financing is directed towards mitigation than adaptation, around 4 times as more towards emissions reductions. And this international finance in particular is heavily skewed towards certain countries, according to a recent report from the Global Center on Adaptation. So a lot of the focus is on Egypt and Morocco in North Africa, and then in the Middle East region towards Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. The UAE, because we're talking from the context of the Emirates, has led the supply of funding from within the region for climate finance for public sector finance at the national level. So the National Bank of Abu Dhabi, for example, issued the first green corporate bond in the region in 2017, and the Central Bank of Egypt issued the region's first sovereign bond in 2020. But these efforts really need to be accelerated. Now, moving to UNEP-FI's core membership. So unusually for a UN organization, we focus more on the private sector, and we have a large membership of banks, including banks in the Middle East and North Africa region. And we reached out to them to develop a survey and set of interviews to see how they are assessing physical risks from climate change, and also attempting to quantify those risks and manage them. So the survey that we carried out covered 18 banks from the region. It was somewhat skewed to 2 focal countries. So that is the Emirates, where we interviewed 10 banks from the country, and then 5 banks from Egypt, and a handful of banks from Morocco and from Bahrain. And we asked them around their identification, assessment of climate risks, management, and then financing, which I forgot to say earlier, of climate adaptation and resilience. In terms of risk identification and assessment, it is starting to happen, is what I can say in summary. Only one bank has identified risks from both climate transition, so that's how economies and societies are responding to transforming our economies towards a low carbon economy, and from physical risks. One further bank is looking at physical risks only, but then the large majority are working on it. So it's really a nascent area of risk analysis in the region. And all of those banks, including the ones that have identified risks, are working on their assessment. There are around 3 to 4 banks that have not started this process at all. In terms of identifying where these climate risks are coming from, and despite this lack of risk assessment, banks are willing to estimate the source of potential climate related risk drivers. So top of those drivers are transition related drivers. So increasingly policymakers, but also markets and consumers are starting to look at how renewable energies are slowly being introduced, and how policymakers are looking at reducing emissions from policy point of view, while only a half consider physical risks, at least slow onset risks, to be a driver, and only a third are looking at acute impacts of climate change, such as extreme weather events or droughts or flooding. Reporting on climate risks, only around a third have picked up the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is really the leading voluntary framework for looking at climate risk on businesses. And this was really a key driver of climate action amongst the business and finance community globally, really, but particularly in North America and Europe, as a voluntary framework for looking at how climate change could have an impact on firms. That is only starting to be picked up by a handful of firms, and perhaps in countries where TCFD is being recommended by central banks and supervisors as a way to frame climate risk assessment and management. Several others are looking at alternative reporting frameworks such as the GRI, while 22%, and that responds to those that are not looking at climate risk yet, are not using any reporting frameworks. Only around 6%, so that's just one bank, was looking at measuring physical risks at the moment. In terms of managing climate risks, of course, if you're not assessing and measuring those risks, it's very difficult to manage them. So a couple that have already looked at physical risks are starting to manage them, and a couple of banks also are planning to do so. Around 4 banks are partially considering relevant national plans. So this is how their businesses respond to nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, because in theory, this should help them to plan how they respond to government policy on adaptation. No banks as yet have targets in place to manage climate-related risks, but this is not really surprising. It's also a very nascent area in Europe and North America, so not really surprising that that has not moved forward as yet. Surprisingly, despite that lack of assessment of physical climate risks, around a third of the banks we asked do claim to offer adaptation-related finance. But perhaps more interestingly is that 5 banks that we surveyed do not know whether they're supporting adaptation finance or not. And perhaps this is understandable, because I think definitions of adaptation and resilience, as I'll come to later, are rather difficult to pin down, and particularly for banks who haven't perhaps had the capacity or haven't looked at this problem for only a short time, would have the frameworks ready for identifying projects that respond to building climate resilience or adaptation. Those that are financing are looking at particular areas. So how can they respond to water stress and to drought? And we can look at the wide range of projects that are aiming to respond to a changing climate, and perhaps the surprise is that they are focused across such a wide range of sectors. Unsurprisingly, though, perhaps the most important sectors are water supply, agriculture, and power generation. One perhaps standout there is oil and gas. Perhaps not surprising in a region, particularly in the Gulf, where oil and gas is so important. But I think that's something that we're aiming to consider under the principles for responsible banking. Of course, making oil and gas projects climate resilient is, of course, important, but can we also consider climate adaptation in the context of projects that are contributing to climate mitigation problems? So some of the financial institutions as well that we interviewed, of course, have their barriers. There is a wide range of barriers that banks are facing. There is a lack of capacity and awareness. And of course, that also means that there is a lack of training. Data is also a big problem. How do they get the data on the projects and activities that they finance? But also, how do they get data around the climate impacts? Some of which, particularly in terms of more long onset risks, will only start to become material perhaps 15 to 20 years hence. Some of them also signal a lack of regulations and public policy, but that, of course, very much depends on the jurisdictions in which they work. So I think I've gone through many of those observations, perhaps also to highlight here that the second last point here, that many conventional finance products, because of course, many of the banks that we interviewed and surveyed didn't consider that they had adaptation-related products or were managing physical risks. But it seems that some conventional finance products do indirectly address adaptation. And I think that's something that a report from the London School of Economics Grantham Institute underlined, is that a lot of firms are responding to changes in climate and how that impacts their businesses. It's just not being tracked or monitored in the way that perhaps multilateral development banks or development organizations would do and have the capacity to do. So just quickly wanted to go over the barriers, which have already been elucidated by some of the banks in the survey. On the one hand, there's an absence of standards and definitions, and that's probably why at least a quarter of the banks didn't really understand whether they were financing adaptation or not. But there's also a perceived lack of profitable opportunities. I mean, often adaptation is seen as a problem for governments and is seen as a public good. So if you look perhaps at coastal flooding, a coastal seawall is a public infrastructure project. And the perception is that those should be supported by grant funding and by governments. And also there's a lack of bankable projects in the pipeline. It's also possible that there are businesses, as I have said, that are already responding to a changing climate and want to obtain financing for their business plans and strategies. But there seems to be a perception that sort of medium to long-term business investments, so projects that would help businesses to adapt over the medium term, so 10 years and possibly beyond, are perhaps not always seen as bankable, in the sense that business loans perhaps do not extend to that period or to that time horizon. There are also market barriers, so physical climate risks are often difficult to quantify and assess and price into markets. They're often location and sector specific, and of course the data access is quite a problem. And also some of the problems could be solved by having the right government policy and regulations. So we've just like to conclude with some of the recommendations that we have put together, and they really focus on some of the key areas that UNEP-FI focuses on with our members. And they include the policy environment. So we do quite a bit of advocacy, at least in terms of helping our financial institution members identify what is the policy environment and what policy changes could be in the pipeline. We also support our members around training and capacity building, and that is an area of real need in terms of physical climate risks and identifying adaptation projects in terms of metrics and project pipelines, and also developing tools and providing access to data. And I know that I'm quite short of time, so I'm not going to go into the details, but I'm sure the slides will be sent out to participants after the call, hopefully. But But I'll skip over the recommendations here and just provide a little bit of background on what UNEP-FI are doing, because it's all very well to produce a report, have a set of recommendations, and we do support some of those recommendations directly, but what can actually be done in terms of scaling adaptation finance? Now, as I said, we also launched a global report, Adapting to a New Climate. And in March this year, we launched a working group of 26 banks. I think there'll be 28 banks by now, a couple of latecomers, who are working towards building guidance on target setting for climate adaptation. And what that will hopefully cover is how banks manage their physical risks, and that includes identifying and assessing those risks, and then working out whether particular activities that they finance are exposed to those risks. It will also cover whether they cover do no harm to adaptation. So is a loan or an investment maladapted to future climate changes? Then are bank strategies aligned and consistent with national and regional adaptation plans? And finally, and this is really the gold standard of that draft guidance, would be how are banks positively contributing to adaptation? Because one thing you can do with managing physical risks is simply not manage those, or simply not finance those sectors or locations anymore. But that wouldn't be contributing to adaptation. So it's about working with clients, with governments and developing financial tools to contribute positively to adaptation. Just to give a very brief overview of UNEP-FI's contribution to finance, we work with over 500 financial institutions worldwide, operating in 139 countries, and that includes around 50% of global banking assets. And in terms of climate change, we help those financial institutions around knowledge and research, around climate risk, around emissions reductions, and around responding to climate change, as I've said, adaptation and resilience. In terms of knowledge and research in the region, we have developed a number of knowledge products. So that includes a study of sustainable and climate finance in the region. We've also looked at how private finance in Egypt and Morocco can be rethought by taking new approaches to adaptation in particular and financing the SDGs. And we've tried to identify financing by some of our banks in the region and how they are responding to developing new financial products and what opportunities might be out there for other banks in the region. In terms of climate risks, we have a number of climate risk assessment and management courses, both online and with a group of banks from our membership. And we also provide bespoke courses at the national and regional level. And of course, we have our flagship program, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which helps our banking members to align with the Paris Agreement and to transition their portfolios towards a net zero economy. And two of the banks in the region that I've highlighted here, First Abu Dhabi Bank and CIB in Egypt, are members of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And meanwhile, we are trying to help other banks that have not joined the Net Zero Banking Alliance by exploring ways towards decarbonisation and helping them to set out the steps that they need to take to work towards that. So there's plenty of information there. I think I've gone slightly over time, Ryden, so apologies for that. But over to you and to the next speaker. Thank you so much for giving me the time to discuss UNEP-FI's work.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that rich engagement. I think it's important to clarify that the majority of the financing gap that we have is in adaptation. And most of adaptation financing is public, including through the multilateral system. And there is a question mark in terms of how do you mobilize further support from the banking sector, from the private sector, and creating products that go beyond offsetting risks towards financing adaptation significantly. Allow me here to invite our colleague Katharina Lehmann from ESCWA to engage with us. Katharina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'll just get the slides, and I hope you can see it properly. All right. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you, Paul, for your interesting presentation. I want to complement what has been said with giving you a brief overview over climate finance needs and flows in the Arab region. Effective climate action needs impactful climate finance. I think we all know this. And to give you a ballpark estimate of the numbers we are talking about, 11 Arab states specified in their NDCs a total financing need of $570 billion by 2030. Just 11 Arab states, $570 billion until 2030. Now, compared to this, the amount of financing that has been coming to the Arab region over the past decade, $34.5 billion in public international climate finance, financing with the principal climate objective only. And even if we take a broader view and also include financing in which climate is a significant objective only, these were $62 billion. That would be the equivalent of 11% of the financing that would be needed to implement the NDCs by 2030. So if you continue at the same pace we've been going over the past decade, we are not getting close to where we need to be. So it's clear there's a climate finance gap. Existing climate finance flows coming to the Arab region fall far short of needs. And it's not just that overall commitments are weak. It's also that the type of financing coming to the region does not respond well to the identified needs and priorities. But I want to start off with a positive note. So if you look at this chart, we can see a positive trend. Financing increased over the past decade, and funds were even dispersed during the pandemic. So that's a good signal. But we see an excessive debt financing. Over the past decade, the region received 7 times more loans than grants. And this, despite this historically high gross public debt burden in the region of $1.4 trillion. We also see an increase in financial commitments from multilateral sources, and bilateral support declined. In addition, private sector financing that is not sourced or mobilized by public international climate finance is not widely available. And the Arab region also hasn't been very successful in accessing funds from global climate funds. Only 4% of the public international climate finance coming to the region was sourced from these global climate funds. There are also geographic disparities in the distribution of funds. Egypt and Morocco have been very successful in costing their needs and in accessing climate finance. But the 6 Arab LDCs, on the other hand, received only 6.6% of public international climate finance coming to the region. And while there have been increases in the financing share directed at LDCs over the past 2 years, it seems that those countries most in need of support are not very successful in accessing funding. And with this, I'm adding to what Paul emphasized already. Arab states identified adaptation as a priority, but this is not reflected in the funding that is coming to the region. Despite some increases in the financing share for adaptation in recent years, adaptation financing remained at around 30% of total climate finance in recent years. And this might be due to the fact that mitigation projects are often more easy to cost and also to secure cost recovery for, because they often have a much shorter time horizon than adaptation projects. And this imbalance in this adaptation mitigation financing is also reflected in the sectoral distribution of funds. We've heard already that the water and agriculture sectors are a priority for adaptation in the Arab region. But the lion's share of financing is going to the energy and transport sectors. Specifically, the energy and transport sectors receive twice the support of the water and agriculture forestry sector combined over the past years. And 4% of the support was directed at disaster risk reduction. Now, what do we do with this? We've seen that both the quantity as well as the quality of current climate finance coming to the Arab region falls far short of needs. So we need to enhance global efforts to scale up climate finance, in particular to scale up grant-based financing for adaptation-relevant sectors, and also to scale up predictable financing to support the planning and strategizing for climate action. There's also a need to raise awareness and to develop knowledge among recipient country stakeholders in order to develop a climate finance strategy, because such a holistic, coordinated, and comprehensive approach to climate finance is really key to accessing funding. There's also a need to develop knowledge in the costing of climate finance needs, in particular costing adaptation needs, because we've heard this already as well. Costing adaptation needs is not straightforward, and for demonstrating the climate rationale of projects. And I want to end my commentary by just mentioning a few efforts that are currently ongoing in the Arab region, because the policy recommendations I've just given are obviously complementing things that are already happening. So first of all, there's the needs-based climate finance strategy for Arab states, which seeks to develop capacity for assessing financing needs and priorities for accessing climate finance and to mobilizing resources from global funds. You might also have heard about the Climate SDG Debt Swap Donor Nexus Initiative, which is an innovative financial instrument to secure reliable and long-term financing by reducing the country's debt burden and improving access to climate finance at the same time. There are also sector-specific initiatives like the Arab Initiative to Mobilize Climate Finance for Water, which was very recently just launched, and which also has an important regional capacity building component. And there are efforts to mobilize climate finance for country-driven projects, such as the Arab Regional Forum on Climate Finance that happened in Beirut in September last year. And at this, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any question you might have.
Thank you very much, Katharina, for your rich engagement. I think it's important to pay attention that we need integrated financing frameworks that would help countries manage the flows of financing, both international as well as domestic, and also noting the dynamics that we have in our region. Perhaps we'll touch on that shortly with our colleagues from IRENA. But first, allow me to invite our colleague, Diep Nguyen, to share with us her commentary. Diep, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to join everyone today. Do we have time for me to share just a few slides?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Raidan, will you be sharing, or should I share?
You should be able to share. Go ahead.
Thank you. I would just share a couple of slides as part of my commentary, just to show everyone IFC's interventions in climate finance.
We can't see the slide.
You cannot, right?
No, we can.
You can see the slides?
Yes.
It's saying to you on my side that there are problems. Okay, so are you seeing this slide right here? I'm sorry, I cannot see the screen and my slides at the same time. Okay, I think now I see them. Excellent. So thank you for having me here today. So let me start with, as you know, the World Bank, the IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. Just go to the next slide. don't seem to be moving to the next slide. Raidan, do you think you can share my slides while I talk? I'll just stop sharing now and maybe move on with just speaking while someone shares the slides for me. I'm sorry to be having technical problems here. Otherwise, I would just speak. So the International Finance Corporation is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. The World Bank, as many of you know, provides loans to member country governments for development projects. We also have within our group the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which provides guarantees for foreign direct investments for non-commercial risks. And at the International Finance Corporation, we also provide guarantees for commercial risks. In terms of private sector investment, we provide financing through private sector companies, whereas our at the World Bank, they provide loans and guarantees, as well as in some cases grants to governments for development projects. Well, we go through private sector companies. We provide the whole stream of services in addition to debt and equity investments. We also provide advisory services. We provide support for early project development, such as pre-feasibility studies, feasibility studies, pilot projects, and we help solve bankability issues before getting to the investment stage. I think one of our presenters mentioned risks earlier. There are many bankability risks, especially for infrastructure projects, and these days in the climate space, new areas such as offshore wind, green hydrogen, battery storage, greening the hard-to-abate sectors such as greening steel, greening cement, and the built environment. These are all worthwhile areas for investment to help with climate adaptation and mitigation challenges. However, they do come with a long project development cycle and lots of risks. And as I mentioned earlier, we at the IFC, together with our partners, the World Bank and MEGA, do provide various levels of risk mitigation tools and instruments. We also help bring in blended finance to help buy down the cost, especially the capex of projects, and help bring them to bankability. We also help mobilize both debt and equity. We have a wide network of mobilization partners, and as a AAA rated financial institution, we bring assurance to developers and financiers for the for development projects. There. Okay, so it did. The slides finally did come up. And as you know, the global sustainable finance market has grown exponentially. It peaked at 1.7 trillion in 2021 and stayed close at 1.5 trillion in 2022. And I expect it to continue scaling up. Sustainable finance products include green loans and bonds, which the IFC is a main anchor issuer of green loans and bonds, as well as blue loans and bonds. We have issued guidelines, a framework for green loans as well as green bonds, and just recently we've issued a framework and guidelines for nature-based financing. We also issue sustainability-linked loans and bonds, which is also a very popular instrument these days. And that means we come in and we help corporations with defining their greening solutions, their climate action plan, and help them define the baseline targets and indicators for their climate action plan, and then work with the corporation to come up with an action plan, including pilot projects or development projects that will help them achieve these climate targets. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this is just a quick slide to show you how much we have issued in green bonds, 11.6 billion over 87 bonds. We issue them in multiple currencies, so far 20, but overall, as part of the International Finance Corporation, we not only in bonds, but other investments, we work in over 80 currencies. And eligible use of proceeds for green bonds and investments include renewable energy. We are a long-term and historical investor, among the first investors in renewable energy. We have financed the largest solar parks, including Ben Park in Egypt, Renew Power in India. We work in, so we finance solar power, wind power, including offshore wind. We, as part of the World Bank Group, have developed offshore wind action plans for over 20 governments, and we continue to do so. We also help these governments define legal regulatory frameworks and licensing permit issues, and basically help them solve the legal and regulatory policy issues to supporting the wind sector and the more challenging offshore wind sector. We also support energy efficiency, certifying green buildings. Our EDGE Green Buildings program certifies whether buildings are reducing their energy use, water use, and GHG emissions from the building materials. We support climate smart forestry and wood products, climate smart agri-solutions, and e-mobility, alternative fuels, and circular economy solutions as well, and biodiversity conservation. The circular economy, I mean, all of these solutions very much are aligned with our sustainability-linked financing, which we make available to corporations as part of the solution to achieve their climate targets. I won't go over the green building eligibility framework. Happy to share that later if everyone's interested. But just to let you know that, again, we have our EDGE Green Buildings program, as well as our APEX Green Cities program, which supports municipal and city governments in defining an action plan for decarbonizing their cities, which include the mobility sector, the built environment, energy efficiency, renewable energy, across the spectrum of climate solutions to help cities get to their climate targets. Maybe let me stop there and take questions as necessary. Again, as the IFC, we have a range of instruments. We, in addition to the financing that we offer to companies, we provide the advisory support. We also provide governments with advisory support and technical assistance. I think what many project developers, as well as financiers and member governments find useful is that in addition to the investments, we provide support in the early project development phase, including the pre-feasibility studies, feasibility studies, environmental and social safeguard studies. We also have advisory services to help support and ensure a just transition, basically interviewing and working with all of the stakeholders, including the local communities, to make sure that the local community benefits in terms of employment creation and economic growth. And not just we focus on the economic and social factors and the benefits of the local beneficiaries.
Thank you very much for your engagement. I think it's important to recognize the important role that the IFC and the broader Bretton Woods institutions play in the architecture of global finance for climate. And I'm positive that the recent evolution and pressing needs for engagement on climate action would allow us to capitalize further on the various instruments. Allow me to invite our colleague Zoheir from IRENA to engage with us on their work. Zoheir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you for the invitation, and I would like also to thank the colleagues who have just made their presentations that were really very informative and very interesting. So please allow me to share my screen with the presentation. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. You might want to maximize it.
Okay, just let me, I have a glitch here. Well, there's something. And now, is it okay?
Yes, excellent.
I still have some issues on the screen. Okay, is it clear now?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, thank you very much. So as far as IRENA is concerned, we have in 2019 launched an initiative with UNDP, SE for All, and with support of the GCF in September 2019 of a new platform to speed up investments in renewable energy projects, which we have called the Climate Investment Platform. So CIP was launched in September 2019. And since then, every partner of the platform has put in place its own approach and its own tools in order to implement this initiative. So as far as IRENA is concerned and the inputs from IRENA on the CIP, well, it seems like it's not moving. Sorry, but I have some glitches on the screen.
You might want to click on the Got It button so that it can.
I did actually. We have recently moved to Windows 11, and since then we've been facing a lot of technical issues actually. It's not moving, the slides are not moving, and I don't know why.
There is a box that says captions and subtitles, so you might want to close that.
I don't have it here on my screen, this box.
Okay, potentially reshare your screen so that you can follow.
Okay, let me stop presenting and then I will reshare it again. Okay.
Yeah, we still have the same problem. So if you can proceed without the slides, that would also be an option.
Okay, so well, that's really very bizarre. Well, I think I will stop presenting and I will. Sorry for that. Now I cannot even. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Let me try again. Okay, now it's working. Okay. So the CIP platform. So the objective of the CIP platform is to accelerate renewable energy projects. And of course, as we all know, it takes around 7 to 9 years on average to bring a project from initiation to commercial operation. And even when we have a very well prepared project, it takes around 2 years to achieve financial closure. In addition to that, we all know that project development is not always related to availability of finance, but more precisely to the availability of bankable projects. And this is where IRENA is trying to bring some value added, specifically on the front of technical assistance. So we work on different fronts. So we work on the upstream, so which means capacity building. And here we mean by capacity building to build capacities with the project developers in order to allow them to prepare bankable projects. We organize also capacity building for local banking institutions to help them address renewable energy projects and to review projects properly and to provide them with the needed tools and financial instruments in order to make a project bankable and allow it to be, developed properly. And we organize also investment forums where, as a result of our work with projects that we have initially reviewed through the CIP platform and to which we have provided technical assistance, then we take them to investment forums where we try to match-make them with potential investors. Up to this day, through the CIP platform, we have received 362 projects that have been submitted. 175 projects have been assessed as eligible for technical assistance and facilitation support. We have provided support to 53 projects, and we have also at the end of the process allowed to reach the financial closure for 3 projects. In this regard, please allow me to note that the majority of the projects that we have seen registered under the CIP are mainly for the mitigation aspect. And I think that this is in line what we have seen from the previous presentations, that the aspect of adaptation is not always very strong as far as not only the MENA region is concerned, but even globally. But many of the projects that have been registered under the CIP were cross-cutting between mitigation and adaptation. So how can projects be registered? Under the CIP, you have 2 buttons. So you have the button on the left, which is the dark blue, and here is to submit a project. And the other button on the right is how to become a CIP partner. It's the blue, the light blue button. This is where partners can register to provide either financial support or technical support to projects. So the cycle starts by the project identification through the CIP, and then we review the project and we see if there is a need for preparation and support or technical assistance. If yes, then the project goes to project preparation and support. And if no, then it goes directly to the investment forum. So during the project preparation and support, this is where we provide technical assistance, and we develop also for project information documents. And we initiate the matchmaking process with potential investors. And then the projects and the potential investors are taken to an investment forum where we do the matchmaking and seek financial closure if possible during the investment forum. But if not, we still follow up with the projects after the investment forum until they reach financial closure. The investment forum is not only organized for matchmaking. The investment forum is also an event where we provide capacity building on policy and regulation, as well as capacity building on relevant issues related to project development and project financing. So it is an overall umbrella that addresses all the aspects that are related to renewable energy project development, because project development is not only about finance, it is also about capacities, skills, knowledge, and policy and regulation frameworks. So here there is, I'm not going to go through the details of this project information documentation that we prepare, but the project documentation, project information document is a very thorough and very detailed document which presents the country context, the project description, the financing plan, the contractual structure, risk and sensitivity analysis, in other to all the documents that are attached to the document, to the project, sorry. So this is, the country context. We look at the current energy mix, the percentage of renewables, capacities and production, a relevant legal and regulatory framework environment, NDC targets and related obligations. Of course, we look also at the project description. How did the project come to life? The project inception, project specificities, partnerships, and discussions with the different stakeholders. And we look definitely at the technical specifications of the project. We try to make sure that the project information document is as detailed as possible in order to provide a thorough documentation and information to the potential investors that could be interested in these specific projects, and matchmake them with potential investors. So I'm going to go through these slides very quickly. Financing plan, about cost and financing, contractual structure, and all the project documentation that is needed is also very thoroughly reviewed within the project information documentation. The contracts regarding engineering, EPC, O&M, insurance and guarantees. So for each contract, we looked at detailed approval process, type of contract, key commercial terms, current status, expected timeline, and key hurdles, if any. And there is also a risk analysis that is conducted for every project. And yes, and of course, there is some appendices and additional documents that are attached to the project information documents, including technical studies, financial model, licenses, information on the sponsor, information on the power sector and the off-taker, financial condition, information on the relevant experience of the EPC and the O&M contractor. The second platform that IRENA has initiated is called ETAF, Energy Transition Accelerator Financing Platform. The difference between the CIP and ETAF, within the CIP, the partners that are registered to provide either financial support or technical support do not make any financial pledge, and they only they are only there to see if through the CIP, they can find projects that could be of interest to them. With the support of IRENA, we provide technical assistance to projects, and we try to match-make them with the potential partners. But there are no financial pledges that are made under the CIP, and every organization, every company is open to register under the CIP as a partner, and every project proponent can register his project under the CIP. Whereas under the ETAF, the ETAF has a history also because it is built on the previous experience of collaboration between IRENA and the Abu Dhabi Development Fund. Within this framework, the Abu Dhabi Development Fund has provided financing for $350 million over a period of 7 years. And following the successful completion of this project, IRENA and Abu Dhabi Development Fund have been have actually launched a new initiative with the support of the UAE that includes other stakeholders in addition to the Abu Dhabi Development Fund. So it is a multi-stakeholder climate finance solution to advance the global energy transition. ETAF aims to accelerate energy transition by directing 1 billion into renewable energy projects in emerging economies. And ETAF leverages its partners' financing and project development expertise to achieve 1.5 gigawatt of project developments before 2030. And the partners of the ETAF for the moment are the Abu Dhabi Development Fund, which has made a soft pledge of $400 million, the Asian Investment and Industrial Bank, Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank that has made a soft pledge of $300 million, and Masdar Company that has also made a pledge of $200 million, but in equity only, Swiss Re to provide de-risking products, and OPEC Fund, with whom we have signed an agreement and is willing to provide funding for technical assistance. The funding instruments under the ETAF are various, and they can be concessionary public lending, but the concessionary is mainly coming from Abu Dhabi Development Fund, and the other partners are providing commercial loans in addition to Masdar equity and Swiss Re in terms of de-risking products. Export credit financing, senior and structured debt equity, de-risking, insurance products, and technical assistance. The funding options can be blending of multiple funding instruments from ETAF partners, partial commitment from one ETAF partner with co-financing from elsewhere. Until today, even though we have not yet signed the border charter of ETAF, the border charter of ETAF is going to be signed on the 25th of May on the sidelines of IRENA's council meeting. But before even we reach that date, we have already achieved more than 1 gigawatt of projects, and the last ones were around 895 megawatts of project in Uzbekistan in partnership with Masdar and AIIB.
Thank you, Zoheir. Allow me to interrupt you here for the sake of time. We still have a few question and answers.
I think I'm reaching the end here. Huh? It's just the last slide about the project eligibility and criteria. So it's about the geographic coverage. So it's global, business development and readiness, projects with pilots completed or with full project feasibility studies, contributing to energy transition, project size, and resource and technology. So this is just to end the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zoheir. I think it's important to recognize the work that IRENA is doing and the success that we have relatively achieved in financing renewable energy, thanks to facilities such as CIP, ETAF, and other instruments, but also the technical and substantive work that IRENA does in support of countries around the world. I was browsing through the Q&A and I see that we do have like 3 clusters of questions. The first clusters perhaps is how can we channel more financing to where it is needed the most, channel that financing for adaptation, channel that financing in the context of LDCs and other vulnerable contexts. I also see a second cluster of questions in terms of access to finance, the issues in relation to capacity restrictions, issues on how do we ensure that we're able to facilitate access to the different instruments, capitalize on the recent and ongoing reforms to making sure that the different funds are available, and how can we make sure that future funds, for instance, the loss and damage facility, would also be accessible to those who need it the most. And on that note, also, there is a bit of discussion in terms of other potential products to help offset some of the risks associated with financing. There was a couple of mentions on insurance and anticipatory action and how can we look into different mechanisms to ensure that as we go for adaptation and as we address increasing need for climate action, is that the financial products, both public and private, are also able to respond along these lines. So I think those are three key questions that I've noticed in the chat. Perhaps we can go with the same order of the speakers to hear some concluding reflections also on those same questions, and then we can close. So perhaps, Paul, you may want to start.
Hi, sorry, I had to move around my house. So yeah, thanks for these excellent presentations. I think what UNEP-FI can bring to the table is simply the network that we have. We have a large membership from the banking community and from the insurance community, and of course we have very close links with our sister organization, the Principles for Responsible Investment. So we do try to engage at all levels of the finance community, and we also have strong links with development finance as well. We are currently looking at adaptation, for example, not only with banks, but also with development finance institutions, because I think really if we want to try to respond to the physical risks of climate change, we do need that cooperation across public finance and private finance to leverage the funds and to de-risk some of the largely, I would guess, market and financial risks that commercial financial institutions are facing. So one example I gave in the chat was the V20 Sustainable Insurance Facility, where we are working both with global insurance firms, but also with V20 countries and banks within those V20 countries to identify where their risks are from climate change and which clients would benefit most from investment in building climate resilience into their businesses. And then through that process, we can aggregate demand for insurance. And I think if we invest, rather than investing, let's say, $5 in climate adaptation, and then 8-9 years down the line, a business is impacted by an extreme weather event, and then they lose that funding. If they have $2 out of that $5 focused on insurance, then at least when those shocks happen, they can rebuild their business and come back again. So I think insurance provides that guarantee where adapted financing can be of more long-term benefit. I'm focusing on adaptation because that's my expertise, but if anyone wants to speak around mitigation, please go ahead.
Katharina?
Thank you for this really interesting discussion and these really interesting presentations. So one of the questions that came up was, how do you address this imbalance in financing between different countries, but also between sectors? How can we scale up adaptation financing? And I think one major component is really to scale up capacity and to raise awareness on how to cost financing needs, because a sound understanding of the costs is really a prerequisite for accessing funding. And I think there is still a lack of capacity, and in particular relating to the costs of adaptation. And that is where ESCWA is working on building capacity, on raising knowledge, and on creating networks for peer learning. And because I think there's a rising interest in green and climate-friendly investments, and it's really how to bring the financing needs and potential funders together. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharina. Perhaps Diep? You disappeared off my screen, so okay.
So I think the question most relevant for IFC is how does a company or a private sector developer with a project or who needs financing for development projects access financing? Well, the first step is to contact one of us at the IFC. If you go to our website and look at the various areas that you work in, you'll see the points of contact. But otherwise, I'm always happy to direct people to the right place, since I am responsible for investments in climate across all industries. So we cover all of the infrastructure industries, including energy, transport, water, the built environment, manufacturing, agriculture and services, and of course, issuing green bonds and loans through banks and financial institutions. So please just contact us. Of course, we can't finance every project that approaches us. We look at who the sponsors are, whether they're creditworthy. We do conduct an appraisal of the project and of the company or the company's plan to make sure that whatever they are proposing has positive benefits for climate adaptation, resilience, and mitigation. I hope that answers the question. I can be more specific if there are specific questions.
Thank you, and thank you for making yourself accessible. Zoheir?
Yes, thank you, Raidan. I think I would like to join my voice to what Katharina has mentioned regarding capacity building, because what we have seen from the CIP specifically is that when we look at the numbers, we have 175 projects that are registered, and we have 3 projects that reach financial closure. So the gap between these 2 figures is very big. And why it is big? It is big for many reasons, but mainly because, as it has already been said here, the projects that are registered are not always up to the requirements of a bankable project, and they really need to be supported, and capacities have to be built among project developers in order to help them prepare and present bankable projects. There is also the fact that the local financing institutions, also the local banks, do not always have the capacities in order to address and to review renewable energy projects. And this is something that we are doing at IRENA. We are providing capacity building workshops for local bankers and local banks, and capacity building workshops for local project developers in order to help them prepare their project. But there is also a need from financial institutions in order to provide more funding for technical assistance. It's not always easy to find funding for technical assistance. We are talking to a number of philanthropists and national and international organizations in order to help us provide funding for technical assistance. We are getting there with some of them. Some of them have made pledges to help us in that front, but I think that there is still a need to increase the financing for technical assistance. We hear a lot about providing funding for projects. So the banks are there to expect to receive bankable projects, but not enough money is provided for technical assistance to support projects. In addition to the overall subject, that the overall umbrella, of project development is the policy and the regulatory framework. Policy and regulations really need to be improved in order to help the financing of renewable energy projects.
Well said. Thank you very much, Zoheir. I think that summarizes our discussion is that first, the demands are significant. There are huge demands for financing various adaptation and mitigation needs, and at the same time looking at also loss and damage. And then there is a mismatch between supply and demand, where the demand is most needed in vulnerable contexts which may not have the capacity required in order to access the available support or compete with others. And we saw that disparity through the presentation that Katharina presented. There are also multiple innovations that various partners are trying to bring forward. A key option is looking at insurance schemes. You need insurance only when the situation has already reached that direction. But the key element to look at is that what it is that we're trying to finance and what's the most appropriate tools. Some of the recent discussions talked about carbon credits, debt swaps. We also have some new discussions on Islamic climate action and Islamic climate finance in the UAE, trying to see how we can leverage the variety of partners. It's always easier to justify a renewable energy plant as a bankable project as opposed to a sea level rising barrier for urban centers who are coastal, for coastal centers who are urban. So there are multiple elements that we need to look at. This is a continuing conversation, and we hope to continue advancing it from now until COP28 and beyond. I would like to thank you all for taking part, and would like to thank the speakers and the panelists for engaging. This event is recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube page, and you can access the recording and future references to go over the slides and the materials. And I would like to invite you to be with us next week in the same time for the next 28 event on the Arctic and climate change in the Arctic. Thank you very much and hope to see you around. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.